Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here. I have to say, when I accepted the invitation, I had anticipated that I wouldn't find a lot of other stuff that was very close to the focus of my own interest. And already, Alison and Louise have given lovely presentations which have a high level of interdigitation with my own interest. So thank you for that. I was very careful to put Omics Group as the organizers of this because I was sensitive to the fact that when I told my minder at Biomed Central, which publishes the open access journal Agriculture and Food Security, of which I am editor-in-chief, my minder at Biomed Central was cool, I should say. And I hadn't quite got the point until I found that the Omics Group, in their presentation of my biography in the documents, has airbrushed Editor-in-Chief Agriculture and Food Security out. I phoned my minder at Biomed Central, who explained they are very much at odds with each other, so I'm sorry about that. At 3 o'clock last night, I woke from a dream about an occasion many years ago when I was preparing to give the keynote lecture at an international conference in Prague, still Czechoslovakia in those days. And on the occasion of that conference, my very dear friend came up to me and said, with a brutal frankness that only very dear friends dare to do, Malcolm, can I just tell you something before you finalize your presentation? And I said, yes, of course you can. And he said, when you speak to Anglophone audiences, you speak very quickly and you show a lot of slides. He said, all that changes when you speak to people who are predominantly not Anglophone. I said, this is all right then. And he said, then you speak even more quickly and you show even more slides. So at 3 o'clock this morning, I thought I'd better take some slides out just in case. And I've removed a lot, which are still available if anybody wants to inquire about them. I'm just thinking that even so, especially since we're so near Heathrow Airport, the illusion may be appropriate. Fasten your seatbelts because I may be going quite quickly. Food security exists when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe and nutritious food to meet their dietary needs and food preferences for an active, healthy life. World Food Summit 1966 came up with that, and it's probably still appropriate. Sustainability, the use of resources at rates that do not exceed the capacity of the earth to replace them. Key issues are water and soil quality, biodiversity, and climate change. Food safety, I dare not say any more about food safety in such company. I thought it might be good to remind ourselves what secure, safe food enables, facilitates perfect health. And for those of you who are not immediately familiar with the English cricket scene, the person on the left is Stuart Broad, who took 8 wickets for 15 runs in the last Australian Test, which for one of the members is likely to be the last Australian Test. And the lady on the right is the most beautiful woman in the world, Aishwarya Rai. That's what's possible. What actually happens is this. Britain's obesity epidemic, Alison spoke about this at some length, and thank you for that, is being fueled by sheer abundance of food. Why am I talking about food security when the problem is too much and we can't control our capacity to take it? I thought it was more than this, actually. In Britain, 25% of adults are obese. 12 million people compared with fewer than 3% in the 70s, and so on. It goes on. This is particularly touching for me because a few weeks ago I was in hospital for surgery for my prostate cancer, and the surgeons registrar came to give me a final checkup to make sure I'd survived the anesthetic, etc. And he looked down at my stomach and actually pointed to it. And he said, "Is it always like that?" And I said, "If you mean, was I clinically obese before I had prostate cancer, then sadly, yes." Anyway, the procedure was sufficiently traumatic that I lost 16 pounds in weight, and God, I'm glad of that. Food security, I think some of you, maybe all of you, know of Thomas Malthus's essay on the principle of population as it affects the future improvement of society, which he wrote in 1798. He said that population increase will always tend to outrun the growth of production. The increase of population will take place if unchecked in a geometric progression, while the means of subsistence will increase only in arithmetic progression. Population will always expand to the limit of subsistence, will be held there by famine, I want to highlight, war and ill health. Lots of people, lots of times have said Malthus has been proved wrong over and over again. There's some nuances about this which you might want to dwell on. But I want to hover over famine. Throughout history, nearly every continent of the world has experience of periods of famine. And I particularly want to highlight, I was rather hoping my dear friend M.S. Swaminathan was going to be here, since he's the special advisor for the conference. And so I chose to dwell on famine in India because he had a part in first-time resolution of that. And you can see there have been lots of famines in India. The last one was the Bengal famine. Many years later, centuries later, Paul Ehrlich wrote the best-selling book, The Population Bomb, in which he wrote, in the 1970s, hundreds of millions of people would starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked on now. Ehrlich also said, I have yet to meet anyone familiar with the situation who thinks India will be self-sufficient in food by 1971. And he insisted India couldn't possibly field 200 million more people by 1980. Well, that sort of, I don't know if any of you actually have heard Paul Ehrlich speak. I mean, he was particularly at that time a magnetic speaker and overwhelmed his audiences who, on the whole, believed he was right. The person who didn't believe he was right was Norman Early's Borlaug, my mentor, God bless him, who instead of just dwelling on the worst possibilities, got to work to start what we now call the Green Revolution. In his work in the Green Revolution, he started off working in Mexico, where he made Mexico self-sufficient in cereals really quite quickly. And somewhat later, he got into contact with Swami, and who had some constructs which looked as if they might be very interesting, some genes rather, which looked as if they might be very interesting. And they worked closely together. And it's an extraordinary story, which I hope you will have the opportunity of hearing from Swami himself, because I will not presume to tell it, about how they gave the lie to Paul Ehrlich's insistence, assertions, and actually made India self-sufficient in grain in the time scale that Ehrlich had said was impossible. And actually, India became an exporter, a net exporter of grain. I should not ignore the vital role of Gurdjieff Kush, who did essentially the same things as Borlaug and Swaminathan was doing with wheat, with rice, greatest rice breeder who ever lived. The Green Revolution has, incredibly to me, often been vilified by NGOs leaders of NGOs over the last few decades. In particular, it's been held to encourage poisons in the environment, fertilizers and pesticides, and to undermine any prospect of maintenance of biodiversity. In fact, that's absolute nonsense, because the Green Revolution made it possible for food supplies to be increased while maintaining the amount of land that was taken up for production of the food. This is one example, actually, I got it from Noam himself, of the way production in India had dramatically increased. While the area used was maintained, it wasn't actually boosted. And so that was one of the ways in which the possibility, it's only a possibility as we now know, of maintaining biodiversity. And obviously the tiger is a key example. It's one that's seriously under threat. But if it hadn't been possible as a result of the Green Revolution to feed India's population to a large extent without increasing the amount of land that was developed, then they would have been gone long ago. It's still a fact that there's been, I mean, my headline is from the Daily Telegraph. You may have worked out my politics by the time we finished this. Daily Telegraph, 1995, alarm over huge rise in obesity. Well, Alison has told us, it's just gone on, got worse and worse and worse. So we now have 7.3 billion people in the world, and more than 2 billion of those, sadly still including me, are obese or overweight. That's a very serious problem. But again, the point has been made earlier, so much food is wasted. And it's been calculated that almost 50% of harvest-ready food in the USA is wasted. So how can we possibly explain, let alone justify this? Approximately 805 million of the 7.3 billion go to bed hungry. And each year, 9 million of them die. Fat people, starving people. We've got to do something to confront this problem. And in 50 years' time, the odds are it's going to get worse unless we and others, with, I use my favorite word again, interdigitating expertise and interests, come together and confront this problem. With 10 billion people in the world, where's it going to go? Well, we can join the vulture in watching and waiting for it to get worse, or we can do our best to lend a hand. I'd like to just dwell for a second or so, a minute or so, on the realities of the demand-supply lines. And you can see, you sometimes see a different calculation. They're all UNFAO calculations, but they sometimes come to different conclusions. This one in the paper written by Toby Bruce refers to the calculation that food supply needs to be enhanced by 70% by 2050. It's very often wave of the arm referred to doubled. Norm used to describe it as doubling actually. But sure as hell, the way things are going, there is no possibility of feeding the population as it is now, let alone as it's rapidly increasing over the next decades. So am I suggesting that we just wait and watch? No, I'm not suggesting it at all. But I will just um, produce some fine print of the enhancement of food supply. Already we're using, as near as damn it is to swearing, all the arable land that is available in the world. We're not going to go on as the first lie to Malthus required, not going to go on increasing agricultural land and then therefore actually increasing productivity, even though he said it wasn't. So we can't do that. 80% of the future growth is probably more than that now, actually, must come from land that's already in use. Most of the increase in production must occur in the countries where the food is consumed. It's no good producing it in the States, UK, elsewhere in Europe. It's got to be produced where it's consumed. I've already said this, there's limited potential for land expansion. And next crucial point, expansion of irrigation is crucial if we're going to meet the food demand. Irrigated agriculture, water availability in other words, is responsible for 70% of global water withdrawals. 17% of cultivated land is irrigated. 40% of the world's food is harvested from irrigated land. And the UNFAO says that by 2030, the world's irrigated area must increase by 50 million hectares. How the hell can that be possible? There just isn't enough water. Those are two problems. Less land, not same amount of land, less land, not the same amount of water even, less water, and global climate change. I imagine most of you are in sympathy with the data that global temperatures are increasing and that global climate change is, to a significant extent, don't necessarily say entirely, a consequence of human activity. Meat eating, for example. Global climate change, we've seen it over the last few decades. We get droughts, we get crop damage in consequence, we get floods, we get storm damage, we get forest fires, we get melting of the ice pack, and millions face starvation as the world warms. So the world's population, I think it was the 10th of October 2011, the world's population achieved, according to the UNFAO's demographers, achieved 7 billion. And there were several papers, including the Sunday Times. Oh, it isn't only the Telegraph I read, that's a relief. Including the Sunday Times, which asked the question, how can we feed 7 billion? They're not talking about the projected 9.5 billion for 2050, 10 billion for 21. How can we even feed the 7 billion? And my friend Clive James produced this analysis of what I call, for the purposes of my lecture title, the challenge. We've got a double crop production. Clive says he went for the doubling, I went for 70% increase by 2050, with fewer resources, less arable land, less water, less fertilizers, which I haven't mentioned yet, less of other agrochemicals like pesticides and fuel, less labor. And as Clive said, no single approach. The leaders of the NGOs say we only have one idea, but Clive has said very clearly, no single approach can feed 9 billion or 10 billion. Conventional crop improvement alone will certainly not feed us. If we're going to double crop production, we have to use other approaches. And the approach Clive takes, and I am shoulder to shoulder with him on this, as was Norman Borlaug, involves genetically manipulated crops. But they are not the silver bullet, they're not the panacea. They must contribute to the solution. So multiple approaches are necessary. Population stabilization will occur. Improved food distribution systems must occur. And the technology component, which I've already alluded to, is, we think, for the moment at least, GMOs. So here's the opportunity to respond to the challenge. The techniques of plant biotechnology. Jim Watson and Francis Crick produced the wonderful paper in 1953 about the structure of DNA. Since then, the discipline of molecular biology has gone up dramatically, producing more and more capacities, including the capacity genetically to manipulate organisms. I dwell particularly on crop plants, but genetic manipulation of animals is a now well-established, much criticized procedure, just as crop gene manipulation is much criticized. I don't propose to go through all the small print. I'll just highlight, as I have done on this slide, the opportunity to reduce stress so that we can grow crops on land where presently we can't grow them, to improve plant performance. Gurdev Kush, the greatest rice breeder who ever lived, produced new plant-type rice, which yields hugely more than even the very best rice that he had produced in his earliest days as principal rice breeder in International Rice Research Institute. Just one example of improved plant performance. Improved nutrition and health, new industries, pharmaceuticals and chemical feedstocks. What's not to like? What's not to appreciate? What's not to ensure we must benefit from here? Let me just hover over the subtext of these. First of all, proven benefits. Improved productivity and income. Protects biodiversity by continuing the trend that Norm introduced in the Green Revolution to grow more food on the same or less land, then protection of biodiversity is enabled. Lower environmental impact. We have the prospect of telling the plants how to make their own pesticides. And so we don't have to spray them over and over again with chemicals. And humanitarian benefits, contributions to poverty alleviation. Global adoption. The NGOs are outraged by this slide, which again is produced by my friend Clive James. The latest figures we have are for the period from 1996, when a growth of genetically manipulated crops, commercial growth of genetically manipulated crops was started, up until 2014, for obvious reasons. That's the last harvest for which we have figures. In 2014, a record of 18 million farmers in 28 countries planted 181.5 hectares of land, a sustained increase of 3 or 4%. And I draw your attention now, as I will later, to the fact these countries blocked out in green are the countries which have made a commitment to growing GM crops. They do not include the UK or most of Europe. Promising future. One of the reasons why the NGOs have criticized GM crops is that they've said they produce the GM characteristics that are introduced are purely for the benefit of the agrochemical industry. The first one that went into commercial practice was weed were plants which were resistant to weed-killing chemicals. And the fact that those weed-killing chemicals were sold by Monsanto, just as the seeds of the weed-killing chemical-resistant plants were sold by Monsanto, turned out to be a bit of an own goal. But that trait, held to be specifically and exclusively for the benefit of Monsanto, actually enabled no-till agriculture, which protected the soil and ensured that the rate of loss of fertile soil was dramatically reduced. But the quality traits which are now highlighted, that one wasn't regarded as a quality trait, include biofortification. Ingo Petricus and Peter Bayer, two colleagues working in Switzerland, dreamed the dream of producing rice which would contain the precursor of vitamin A, so that those people who get most of their calories from rice would not continue to be deprived of vitamin A. They produced what is called golden rice 12 years ago. They demonstrated, they answered all the questions that the GMO people had asked, and still Greenpeace says that as a matter of principle, they will never permit golden rice to be grown in the field. Ingo, who is even older than me and even more decrepit than me, God bless him, is talking very seriously of challenging Greenpeace on the basis of their crime against humanity by stopping the growth of golden rice. I hope that in the fairly near future, golden rice will actually get into the field. And I'll just draw your attention to the top right-hand block. Golden rice contains the genes required to activate the biochemical pathway leading to beta-carotene, provitamin A. Intensity of the color represents the concentration of the compound. Proof of concept was completed in 1999. It's still not in the field. It's outrageous. This is a much more recent thing, which probably most of you are not familiar with. Professor Ted Cocking from the University of Nottingham has achieved many great things in the field of plant biotechnology. The one thing I want to dwell on is his appreciation of something that Norman Borlaug said in his Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech in 1970, when Norman pointed out that one of the things that had made possible the Green Revolution was the Haber-Bosch process for the production of nitrate, because Green Revolution cereals could not achieve their yield miracles were it not for heavy application of synthetic fertilizer. But in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, Borlaug said that his dream was that one day it would be possible to create nitrogen-fixing cereals that actually took their nitrogen from the air. And he visualized the introduction of the same capacity that peas and beans have, leguminous plants have, for production of nodules on their roots, which are the home for nitrogen-fixing bacteria. In fact, that approach proved unsuccessful, and Ted realized quite early in his assault on this mission that it wasn't going to be possible. And so he started to look elsewhere, and he homed in on a nitrogen-fixing bacterium that, in the normal way of things, makes its home in sugar beet. This nitrogen-fixing bacterium, Gluconacetobacter diazotrophicus, can now be introduced to cereals, wheat, maize, rice. Ted's not only got this bacterium into cereals, he's demonstrated that it will fix nitrogen in the cereals, and wonderfully, he's demonstrated that in the field, these modified plants can satisfy more than 50% of their nitrate fertilizer requirement directly from the air. Ted's well into his 80s, but he still works in the lab every day, and he has become an entrepreneur in the last couple of years and started a company called Exotic Technologies, which produce N-fix fertilizers, and they can actually produce seeds which are coated with material which includes Gluconacetobacter and can fix their own nitrogen, or at least 50% of it. The amount will be increased as things go on. So, great work. The impact of pests, weeds, and diseases. Crop losses by pests, weeds, and diseases have not increased since the 1960s, although the illustration is compares 65 with 92. It's still, the assertion is still true. So the reduction of weeds and diseases is of vital importance as we move towards this target of feeding 10 billion people while maintaining biodiversity and minimizing environmental impact. A group led by John Pickett at Rothamsted Research have been testing an approach which I think is charmingly imaginative, in which they first isolated and chemically identified the aphid alarm pheromone, the compound which aphids produce when they're being eaten to tell other aphids, buzz off because this is not a good place to be, you'll get eaten. He did that, and he introduced, or his team introduced, the aphid alarm pheromone into wheat. This then enabled a management strategy where it turned out that the aphid alarm pheromone not only repelled pests. When the pests went in and had a little chew, straight away the alarm pheromone was released from the plant cells into which it had been reduced by genetic engineering, and they were repelled. But a special benefit, to the delight and surprise of John Pickett, was that it attracted things like ladybirds and other things that actually eat the aphids. So it worked both ways. This management strategy is simply brilliant, it seems to me. It worked perfectly on transformed wheat in the laboratory. And there was a lot of banging of drums when the field test was started. The field test had to have umpteen shots because the eco-terrorists came in and climbed over fences and wrecked the crop. In the end, John and his colleagues mounted a counter-campaign based on just telling the truth. This is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it, this is how we're doing it, this is what we hope to achieve. And he was then allowed to get on with the field tests. The story, sadly, for the moment, but only for the moment, has a sad twist. Because although the strategy had worked perfectly in the greenhouse, under contained conditions in the greenhouse, it didn't work in the field. There was no statistical difference between the assault by the aphids in the field. But watch this space. He will solve it as night follows day. So I beg you to believe that plant biotechnology can deliver food security via an evergreen revolution. Once again, you may not know that the term evergreen revolution was coined by M.S. Swaminathan. And the evergreen revolution should produce higher yield, higher quality crops with lower input and lower environmental impact. I won't dwell on those things because I'm sure I'm running out of time. Have I gone wrong? Damn it, I missed some slides out. You've already seen the slide of global adoption, 18 million farmers, etc., 28 countries have adopted it. Promising future, I've spoken about already. So I go on to the safety record, which is much challenge. And once again, assure you, on behalf of all those companies that are producing these plants, companies and public laboratories which are producing them, that commitment to safety is the top priority through the research and development process. It starts with safety assessment of the genes and proteins and carries on to continuous quality control. The safety of the products and the benefits of the products, the GM crops, biotech crops, as Clive calls them. I hate that name, incidentally. You can see the groups that have spent billions of pounds assessing the safety. The very best scientists have brought their expertise to bear. World Health Organization, FAO, the United Nations, National Academy of Sciences of the US, Royal Society of London, American Medical Association, French Academy of Medicine, European Commission, US, and so on. They've all written lengthy reports saying these things are as safe as foods produced by any other means and should be brought to bear on humankind's needs. I just threw in for your delectation earlier the point that Norman Borlaug, the man who fed the world, I love that title, was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for initiating the Green Revolution. And when he was giving his Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech, he said, "It is time that the tide of the battle against hunger was changed for the better, but ebb tide could soon set in if we become complacent." He didn't labor the point, because those who were presenting it had done so, that without food security, then there is huge pressure from the people who are food insecure to say, "You've got food, I haven't got it, I'm coming to take yours because it's my right." And we've all lived through this period where, first of all, in 1998, food price rises threaten global security. United Nations officials. There was so much talk about this, and there were riots and there were deaths. This graph, which is at risk as being irritating, I doubt if the people at the back can see it, but it shows the way in which food price rise spikes are correlated with increases in food riots. In North Africa in particular, we're most, almost there, food price rises are correlated with riots, usually associated with huge amounts of deaths, and often associated with the complete overthrow of regimes. Whether the overthrow of regimes, as prove to be for the better or for the worse is something you'll all have opinions of. This is going to go on unless we can properly confront our need for enough food to feed the world. No one fed the world in the 1960s, even 1970s. But 10 billion people by the end of the century have got to be fed. Okay, we've got possibilities of forced contraception and so on, but maybe we don't want to spend too much time on that. So I urge you to believe that GM crops are one component of the strategy for confronting this challenge. I show this slide again just to remind you that the UK, most of Europe, and I didn't say this before, most of Africa are places where GM crops are not grown. In Britain and most of the rest of Europe, we're fat people who actually can get by perfectly well without extra food. But the fact that the NGOs, by their misinformation, disinformation, and lies, are persuading people that this is a technology which mustn't be exploited, has ended up in the hands of people in Africa who are not leaders of countries full of fat people, who actually need this technology. Dreadful situation. It seemed that maybe we might be having a move in the right direction when Owen Paterson, at that time Minister of Agriculture, and David Cameron said, we've really got to espouse this technology. We've got to start using it. The European Union has, to some extent, softened its attitude, leaving it to individual countries now. But only yesterday, the news said that the Scottish Parliament has decided that under no circumstances will it allow GM crops to be grown or used in Scotland. Thank you for listening.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you very much. It was a very stimulating talk and very interesting to hear. I've probably got time for one question. Sorry, I'm going by speed of hand there, I'm afraid.
Hi, I have a concern regarding the food safety in India.
I'm so sorry, I can't hear you.
I have a question regarding the food safety, especially in India. Recently, there has been a case of this detection of lead. The levels was as high as 17 times higher than the permissible level of lead, right?
I am so sorry, I still can't hear you.
Okay. Recently, there has been a case on the detection of lead in Nestlé's Maggi product, right?
Yeah.
So, is that to do something with the Green Revolution in India? Are we sacrificing the food safety in the name of food security?
Your basic tenet, if I understand it correctly, is I am convinced. I regard myself as a great friend of India. I've been to India many times. Swaminathan is my special friend. And I believe it's nonsense to say that food safety is being sacrificed for food security. As a matter of fact, I think India, I wrote an article for the Indian Times magazine, journal, newspaper, whatever it's called, saying that India had led the Green Revolution. It should be leading what Swami calls the Evergreen Revolution, namely bringing GM techniques at full bore to bear on Indian needs. India won't even allow the growth of BT brinjal, for God's sake. BT brinjal, key food, is being grown in Pakistan, and nobody's having any problem with it. But India won't even do that. India is not sacrificing food safety. It's claiming to protect food safety when it's doing nothing more than protecting prejudice. and it is putting food security at risk. And India, of all people, of all countries, having, through Swami, through Nom, led the green revolution, should be moving us forward very quickly to this. But I'm sorry if that confronts your question, your observations, but I think it's nonsense.
I think that might be one for a debate over lunch. Okay, one very quick question, and if you can keep your answer very short, please, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. One quick question. I'm just thinking of, because you talked about food security locally, globally and stuff, do you have any numbers about, well, in Europe, the biogas production is quite taking on. Do you have any numbers how, whether that is kind of a threat to the food production or food security? You know, if you think of all the crops that are being grown to throw into the fermentation tanks for biogas production, instead of wheat or corn or whatever being harvested for human or animal consumption.
Sorry, would you be kind enough to repeat that?
Okay, right.
Okay, can I maybe summarize it?
Yeah. My question is, my question is about biogas production. So,
biofuels.
Okay.
Yeah,
so the increasing hectares, thousands of hectares being used to grow crops, to grow corn, to grow wheat, and throw it into fermentation tanks, is that a threat to the food production, food security?
I must confess, I am not informed, but I do feel a tension. The point's been made that taking maize to put fuel in the tanks of limousines instead of putting food onto the plates of hungry people is immoral. There are a whole series of nuances to that, but certainly it's not something that I would wave of the arm. I would not, with a wave of the arm, challenge the implied assertion.